The old bus wheezed to a stop outside the grand iron gates of Berkshire Music Academy. David stepped off, clutching his worn backpack tight against his chest. The September morning air was crisp and he could see his breath forming small clouds as he exhaled nervously. He had never seen a building like this before. The academy looked more like a palace than a school. Tall white columns stretched up to a roof that seemed to touch the clouds. Stone steps led to massive wooden doors that could have belonged to a castle. Everything about this place screamed money and tradition. David looked down at his clothes. His only suit was from the thrift store downtown. The pants were a little too short and the jacket sleeves barely reached his wrists. His shoes were polished to a shine, but the scuff marks still showed through. His mother had worked extra shifts at the diner for 3 weeks just to buy him this outfit. Other students were arriving too, but they came in very different ways. Sleek black cars with tinted windows pulled up to the front entrance. Drivers in uniforms jumped out to open doors for young men and women who stepped out like they owned the world. Their clothes looked like they cost more than David's family made in a month. One girl emerged from a silver Mercedes carrying what looked like a violin case made of real leather. Her dress was probably designer and her hair was perfectly styled. She walked up those stone steps like she had done it 1,000 times before. A boy about David's age got out of a BMW. He was talking loudly on his phone about his private music teacher and how his family had donated money to build the academy's new concert hall. His confidence made David feel even smaller. David pulled out his phone to check the time. It was an old model with a cracked screen, but it worked. He had 45 minutes before his audition. Plenty of time to find the right room and maybe practice a little if they had a piano available. He walked through those intimidating front doors and immediately felt like he had entered another world. The floor was made of marble that reflected the light from crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. Oil paintings of famous musicians lined the walls. Everything echoed when you walked, making each footstep sound important. The other students seemed to know exactly where they were going. They chatted easily with each other, talking about summer music camps in Europe and private lessons with famous teachers. David heard one boy mention that his teacher had studied under a student of Mozart. Another girl was complaining that her grand piano at home was out of tune and needed a professional tuning. David found the reception desk, where a woman in an expensive-looking suit was checking in the audition candidates. When it was his turn, he handed over his paperwork with hands that shook slightly. "Name?" she asked without looking up. "David Rodriguez," he said quietly. She flipped through some papers, frowning. "Oh yes, you're the community scholarship candidate. You'll be auditioning in room C12. That's down the hall. Take the elevator to the 2nd floor, then turn right." The way she said community scholarship candidate made it sound like something unpleasant. David nodded and headed toward the elevator, trying not to let her tone bother him. As he walked down the hallway, he passed practice rooms where students were warming up. Through the small windows in the doors, he could see them playing expensive-looking instruments. The sounds that drifted out were beautiful but somehow cold and technical. David thought about his own practice space back home. It was a corner of the community center's basement, where an old upright piano sat next to the furnace. The piano was missing a few keys and some of the others stuck when you pressed them. But it had been his refuge for the past 12 years. He remembered the first time he had touched those keys. He was 7 years old, and his mother had brought him to the community center while she attended her English classes. David had wandered around the building and discovered the piano sitting alone in that basement corner. When he pressed a key, the sound that came out was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the community center, found him there an hour later, picking out simple melodies by ear. She had studied piano years ago and offered to teach him the basics. That was the beginning of everything. For years, David had spent every free moment at that old piano. While other kids played video games or watched TV, he was in that basement, learning to read music from library books and practicing until his fingers ached. He taught himself advanced pieces by watching YouTube videos on the community center's ancient computer. His mother worked 2 jobs and couldn't afford private lessons, but she never complained about the time he spent at the piano. She would bring him dinner sometimes, sitting quietly in a folding chair while he played. "You have a gift, mijo," she would tell him. "Don't let anyone tell you different." Now, standing in this palace of music education, David wondered if his gift was enough. Everyone here had advantages he could never imagine. They had private teachers, expensive instruments, and parents who understood the music world. All he had was passion and thousands of hours of practice on a broken piano. The elevator arrived, and David stepped inside with two other students. They were discussing their summer at some prestigious music festival, talking about conductors and composers like they were family friends. David remained quiet, clutching his backpack tighter. His sheet music was in that backpack, photocopied so many times that some of the notes were barely visible. He had spent his own money at the library to print out the pieces he would play today. The pages were worn from being handled so much during practice. As the elevator climbed to the second floor, David closed his eyes and tried to calm his nerves. He thought about all the hours he had spent preparing for this moment. The early mornings before school when he would practice before the community center opened. The late evenings when he would stay until the janitor had to kick him out. He thought about his mother, who was probably serving coffee and pancakes at the diner right now, wondering how her son's audition was going. She had never heard of Berkshire Music Academy before David showed her the scholarship application, but she understood what it meant to him. The elevator doors opened, and David stepped out into another marble hallway lined with more portraits of dead composers. He found room C12 and sat down on a bench outside to wait for his turn. Other candidates sat on similar benches, some practicing fingering exercises in the air, others reviewing their sheet music one last time. David pulled out his own music and looked it over, even though he could play these pieces in his sleep. In 30 minutes, he would walk into that audition room and sit down at a piano that probably cost more than his family's car. He would play for judges who had trained at the world's best music schools. And somehow he would have to prove that a kid from the wrong side of town who learned piano in a basement was worthy of walking these marble halls. David took a deep breath and tried to remember Mrs. Patterson's words from that morning when he called to tell her about his audition. Music doesn't care where you come from, David, it only cares what you have to say. Professor Jonathan Whitmore adjusted his expensive tie as he walked down the marble hallway of Berkshire Music Academy. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the floor with each confident step. At 55, he had been the Academy's director for nearly 2 decades, and he wore his position like a perfectly tailored suit. Everything about Professor Whitmore screamed old money and classical education. His silver hair was always perfectly combed back, and his suits were custom-made by a tailor whose family had been dressing musicians for generations. He had studied at the finest conservatories in Europe, and his office walls were covered with photos of him shaking hands with famous conductors and composers. As he passed the reception desk, he noticed the woman checking in the day's audition candidates. "How many do we have today, Mrs. Hartford?" he asked, glancing at his gold watch. 12 candidates for the scholarship program, Professor," she replied, handing him a folder. "The usual mix of talent and, well, you know how these community outreach programs go." Professor Whitmore flipped through the applications with the air of a man who had seen it all before. Most of the names were familiar to him, not personally but by reputation. These were the children of former students, the sons and daughters of wealthy families who had been grooming their kids for places like Berkshire since birth. Then his eyes stopped on one application that made him frown. "David Rodriguez," he read aloud. "Community center training, no private instruction, scholarship applicant from..." He looked at the address and his frown deepened. That was definitely not the right side of town. "Oh yes, that one," Mrs. Hartford said, lowering her voice. "He's part of that new community outreach program the board insisted we try. You know how they are about looking good for the newspapers?" Professor Whitmore sighed heavily. The Board of Trustees had been pressuring him to accept more students from diverse backgrounds, claiming it would be good for the Academy's image. He understood the politics, but he also understood reality. Students from places like that simply didn't have what it took to succeed at an institution like Berkshire. It wasn't that he was against giving people opportunities. It was just that music at this level required more than raw talent. It required years of proper training, exposure to culture, an understanding of the classical tradition that could only come from growing up in the right environment. These community center kids, no matter how well-meaning, were simply starting from too far behind. He had seen it before. Every few years, some student would show up with a sob story about learning piano on their own or practicing on broken instruments. They would play with enthusiasm and even some skill, but they always lacked the refinement, the proper technique, the deep understanding that came from serious musical education. Suppose we have to go through the motions, he said to Mrs. Hartford. But let's not waste too much time on the obvious cases. Professor Whitmore made his way to the faculty lounge, where several other teachers were preparing for the day's auditions. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the piano department head, was reviewing scores while sipping her morning tea. Professor Hamilton from the strings department was polishing his glasses and looking over applications. "Good morning, everyone," Professor Whitmore announced as he entered. "I trust you're all prepared for today's interesting mix of candidates." Dr. Chen looked up from her papers. "I've reviewed most of the applications. There are some promising students this year. The Morrison girl has been studying with Petrov since she was 8. And the young man from the Wellington family has already performed with the Youth Symphony. Yes, those are exactly the kind of students who belong here," Professor Whitmore agreed. "Unfortunately, we also have some community outreach cases to deal with. I'm sure you saw the Rodriguez application." Professor Hamilton shook his head. "I still don't understand why the board insists on these publicity stunts. We're not a social service agency. We're an institution dedicated to excellence in classical music." "Exactly," Professor Whitmore said, settling into his favorite leather chair. "Music at this level isn't something you can just pick up at a community center. It requires years of proper instruction, exposure to the great traditions, an understanding of culture that, frankly, these students just don't have." He had built his reputation on maintaining the Academy's standards. Under his leadership, Berkshire graduates had gone on to perform with major orchestras and win international competitions. That kind of success didn't happen by accident. It happened because he knew how to identify real talent and real potential. Still, Dr. Chen said thoughtfully, "Sometimes talent can surprise you. I remember a few years ago that girl from the public school who actually showed some promise." "Promise, yes," Professor Whitmore replied. "But where is she now? Working at some music store, teaching elementary school children." That's exactly my point. Without the proper foundation, without the right background, they hit a ceiling. They can never reach the level our real students achieve. The conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Hartford's voice over the intercom. "Professor Whitmore, the first audition candidates are arriving. Should we begin with the morning session?" "Of course," he replied, straightening his tie again. "Let's get this over with. The sooner we finish with the obvious cases, the sooner we can focus on the students who actually matter." As he walked toward the audition rooms, Professor Whitmore felt the familiar weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Berkshire Music Academy had a reputation to maintain. Parents paid enormous tuition fees because they trusted him to preserve the institution's excellence. He couldn't let misguided charity work compromise that trust. He passed by room C12, where he noticed a young Hispanic man sitting on the bench outside, clutching a worn backpack. The boy's clothes were clearly second-hand and his shoes, while polished, had seen better days. This had to be the Rodriguez kid. Professor Whitmore paused for a moment, observing the boy from a distance. There was something about his posture that irritated the professor. The boy didn't look nervous or intimidated the way these community cases usually did. Instead, he seemed calm, almost serene, as if he actually believed he belonged here. That kind of misplaced confidence bothered Professor Whitmore more than obvious nervousness would have. At least nervous students understood the magnitude of what they were attempting. This boy seemed to think that wanting something badly enough was the same as being qualified for it. He made a mental note to handle this audition quickly and efficiently. There was no point in drawing it out or giving the boy false hope. Better to make it clear from the beginning what the standards were, so the disappointment wouldn't be too crushing. Professor Whitmore continued to his office to collect his things for the morning session. His assistant had already prepared his folder with score sheets and evaluation forms. He glanced at his schedule and saw that the Rodriguez audition was scheduled for 10:30, right after two of the more promising candidates. Perfect, he thought. By the time they got to the community case, everyone would already be warmed up and in the right mindset to maintain proper standards. It would be a good contrast to demonstrate what real musical education could accomplish, versus what happened when students tried to take shortcuts. He looked out his office window at the Academy's beautiful grounds, where morning sunlight was streaming through the old oak trees. This place represented everything he valued about classical music: tradition, excellence, proper training, and respect for the art form. He had dedicated his life to protecting those values. In a few hours, he would sit in that audition room and listen to another community center student try to prove that enthusiasm could replace years of proper instruction. He would be polite but firm, maintaining his professional standards while making it clear that good intentions weren't enough. Professor Whitmore had no way of knowing that in less than 2 hours, everything he believed about talent, background, and musical greatness was about to be turned upside down by a 19-year-old boy with worn-out shoes and photocopied sheet music. The audition room door opened with a heavy creak, and David looked up to see a stern-faced woman in a navy blue suit gesturing for him to enter. His heart was beating so fast he was sure everyone could hear it echoing off the marble walls. "David Rodriguez?" she asked, checking her clipboard. When he nodded, she continued, "I'm Mrs. Hartford. Please come in for your audition." David stood up, adjusted his backpack one more time, and walked through the doorway into what felt like a courtroom rather than a music room. The space was enormous, with high ceilings and tall windows that let in streams of afternoon sunlight. At one end of the room sat a panel of 3 judges behind a long mahogany table. But it was the piano that made David's stomach drop. In the center of the room sat an old upright piano that looked like it had seen better days. The wood was scratched and faded, and even from across the room David could see that some of the keys were slightly yellowed with age. This was not the beautiful grand piano he had expected, not the kind of instrument he had dreamed about playing for his audition. The contrast was jarring. Everything else in the room screamed luxury and prestige, but the piano looked like something that might belong in the community center where David had learned to play. Professor Whitmore sat in the center of the judges' panel, his silver hair perfectly styled and his expression unreadable. To his left sat Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the piano department head, who was shuffling through some papers. On his right was Professor Hamilton, who looked up briefly when David entered, then returned his attention to his notes. "Please take a seat at the piano," Professor Whitmore said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. David walked across the room, his footsteps echoing in the large space. As he got closer to the piano, he could see more details that concerned him. A few of the black keys were chipped, and the piano bench was old and wobbly. This was definitely not what the other candidates had been playing on. He sat down carefully on the bench, testing its stability, and placed his worn sheet music on the music stand. The papers looked even more shabby in this elegant room, with their photocopied edges and slightly crumpled corners. Professor Whitmore leaned back in his chair and made a show of checking his expensive watch. "We're running a bit behind schedule today," he announced to the room, though his eyes never left David. "I trust you understand the importance of efficiency in these proceedings." David nodded, trying to ignore the dismissive tone in the professor's voice. He had dealt with people who looked down on him before. It came with the territory of being from his neighborhood, of wearing clothes from thrift stores, of having a mother who worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. "Before you begin," Professor Whitmore continued, standing up and walking around the table toward the piano, "I feel I should address something." He gestured broadly at the upright piano with an expression of mock concern. "You see, we had a small scheduling conflict today. Our usual performance grand piano is being used for another event. I hope you don't mind making do with this substitute." The way he said substitute made it clear that this was no accident. Professor Whitmore's eyes held a glint of something that looked almost like amusement, as if he were enjoying a private joke. "You call that piano?" Professor Whitmore asked, his voice dripping with artificial sympathy. He gestured at the old upright as if it were a broken toy. "I suppose it matches your background. Don't waste too much of our time." The words hit David like a slap across the face. The professor hadn't even heard him play yet, but he had already decided that David wasn't worth the effort. The message was crystal clear. "You don't belong here, and we're going to make sure you know it." Dr. Chen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her pen hovering over her evaluation form. Professor Hamilton looked up from his papers with raised eyebrows, clearly surprised by his colleague's bluntness, but he said nothing. David felt heat rising in his cheeks, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had expected this in a way. His mother had prepared him for the possibility that not everyone would welcome him with open arms. "Some people judge a book by its cover, mijo," she had told him. But music speaks louder than prejudice. Professor Whitmore returned to his seat behind the judge's table, settling back with the air of a man who was already bored by what he was about to hear. He picked up his pen and made a note on David's evaluation form before David had even touched the piano keys. "Whenever you're ready," Professor Whitmore said, though his tone suggested he would prefer if David weren't ready at all. David looked down at the piano keys, running his fingers lightly over their surface. The keys felt different from what he was used to. Some were loose, others required more pressure than usual. But there was something familiar about this piano, too. It reminded him of the old upright at the community center, with its imperfections and quirks. He thought about Mrs. Patterson, who had first shown him how to place his hands on the keys 12 years ago. She had taught him that a real musician could make music on any instrument, that the piano was just a tool to express what was in your heart. The piano doesn't make the music, she had always told him. The music comes from inside you. The piano just helps everyone else hear it. David glanced up at the judges one more time. Professor Whitmore was looking at his watch again, making it obvious that he was counting the seconds until this audition would be over. Dr. Chen was staring at her evaluation form, her expression neutral but professional. Professor Hamilton was actually looking at David with what might have been curiosity. For a moment, David considered the possibility of just getting up and walking out. He could save himself the embarrassment of playing on this substandard piano in front of people who had already decided he wasn't good enough. He could go home to his mother and tell her that the academy wasn't right for him after all. But then he remembered all the hours he had spent in that basement at the community center. All the mornings he had gotten up early to practice before school. All the evenings he had stayed late, working through difficult passages until his fingers knew them by heart. He remembered the night he had first played Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor. All the way through without mistakes, Mrs. Patterson had been in the room, and when he finished, there were tears in her eyes. "That's not just playing, David," she had whispered. "That's making music." David straightened his shoulders and placed his hands over the keys. Professor Whitmore wanted to see what a community center kid could do on a second-rate piano. Fine, he was about to find out. The room fell silent except for the sound of David adjusting his position on the bench. Even Professor Whitmore stopped fidgeting with his papers and looked up, waiting for the inevitable disappointment. What none of them realized was that they were about to witness something that would change everything they thought they knew about talent, training, and the true meaning of musical excellence. David's fingers hovered over the keys for just a moment longer, and then he began to play. Instead of immediately launching into his prepared piece, David did something that surprised everyone in the room. He sat quietly for a moment, his hands resting gently on the keys, and simply listened to the space around him. The audition room had its own personality, its own acoustic fingerprint. The high ceilings would make certain notes ring longer, while the hardwood floors would add a slight brightness to the sound. David had learned to read rooms like this during his years practicing in different spaces at the community center, sometimes in the basement, sometimes in the main hall, sometimes in the small practice rooms when they were available. Professor Whitmore shifted impatiently in his chair, about to say something about getting started, when David began to test the piano itself. He pressed each key individually, starting from the lowest note and working his way up the keyboard. His touch was light and precise, like a doctor checking a patient's pulse. Some keys responded normally, others needed a bit more pressure, and a few had a slight delay before the hammer struck the string. The middle C was slightly flat, and there was a subtle buzz in the F above middle C that suggested a loose string. But David wasn't frustrated by these imperfections. He was learning to work with them. Dr. Chen looked up from her papers, intrigued despite herself. In 20 years of judging auditions, she had never seen a student take time to actually get acquainted with the instrument before playing. Most candidates, especially nervous ones, just sat down and started playing whatever they had prepared, hoping to get through it without making mistakes. David's fingers moved across the keyboard in gentle arpeggios, not showing off but genuinely exploring how this particular piano wanted to be played. He discovered that the lower register had a warm, woody tone despite the instrument's age, and the upper register still had a bright, singing quality that could cut through the room's acoustics. Professor Whitmore watched this display with growing irritation. This was exactly the kind of pretentious behavior he expected from community center students, trying to make themselves seem more sophisticated than they actually were. "Anytime you're ready to actually play," he said sharply. But David wasn't putting on a show. This was exactly how Mrs. Patterson had taught him to approach any new piano. "Every instrument has its own voice," she had explained. "Your job isn't to force it to sound like something else. Your job is to find out what it wants to say and help it say that as beautifully as possible." David adjusted his posture on the bench, sitting up straight but relaxed. His shoulders dropped naturally and his arms hung loose at his sides. Then he placed his hands back on the keyboard in the classic pianist's position, fingers curved, wrists relaxed, arms creating a natural line from shoulder to fingertip. Even Professor Hamilton, who taught strings rather than piano, could see that David's hand position was textbook perfect. This wasn't the sloppy, self-taught technique he had expected from someone without formal training. David closed his eyes for just a moment, not out of nervousness, but to center himself. This was another thing Mrs. Patterson had taught him, to find that quiet space inside where the music lived, before letting it flow out through his fingers. In that moment of silence, David thought about the piece he was about to play. Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor was one of the most challenging pieces in the piano repertoire, both technically and emotionally. It told a story, beginning quietly and mysteriously, building through moments of passion and turmoil, then finding resolution in a final, dramatic conclusion. David had chosen this piece not to show off, but because it meant something to him. He had first heard it on an old recording at the library, played by a famous pianist whose name he couldn't even pronounce. But something about the music had reached inside him and touched a place he didn't even know existed. He had worked on this piece for over 2 years, learning it bit by bit, measure by measure. There were nights when he had stayed at the community center until closing time, working through the most difficult passages over and over until his fingers ached. There were mornings when he had arrived early, before anyone else was awake, to practice the delicate, quiet sections that required the most subtle touch. Now, sitting at this imperfect piano in front of judges who had already decided he wasn't good enough, David felt a strange sense of calm. All those hours of practice, all those years of dreaming about this moment had led him here. Whatever happened next, he was going to play this music the way it deserved to be played. He opened his eyes and looked down at the keys one more time. His hands found their starting position, the left hand ready to play the opening bass notes, the right hand poised to enter with the main melody. The judges were all looking at him now with varying degrees of attention. Professor Whitmore was still checking his watch, but Dr. Chen had put down her pen and was actually focusing on David for the first time since he had entered the room. Professor Hamilton had stopped writing notes and was waiting to hear what would come next. David took one slow, deep breath, feeling his rib cage expand and his shoulders settle into their natural position. This was it. This was the moment when all those years of practice, all those dreams, all those hours in the basement of the community center would either prove themselves or fall short. But as his fingers touched the keys for the opening notes, David realized that he wasn't nervous anymore. He was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The piano might be imperfect, the judges might be skeptical, and his clothes might be from a thrift store, but the music that was about to fill this room was real. The first notes of Chopin's Ballade began to emerge from the old upright piano, and everyone in the room could immediately tell that something extraordinary was about to happen. David's touch was so controlled, so precise, that the piano's imperfections seemed to disappear. Instead of fighting against the instrument's limitations, he was working with them, finding ways to make them part of the music itself. Professor Whitmore's pen stopped moving across his evaluation form. Dr. Chen leaned forward slightly in her chair. Professor Hamilton's eyebrows went up in surprise. The real performance was just beginning, and none of them were prepared for what they were about to hear. The opening notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor floated through the room like whispered secrets. David's left hand established the mysterious questioning bass line, while his right hand waited for exactly the right moment to enter with the main melody. Even these first few measures revealed something remarkable. This wasn't just technically accurate playing. This was music being born. Professor Whitmore's hand had stopped moving across his evaluation form. Despite his determination to get through this audition quickly, Something about these opening phrases made him pause. The boy's touch was impossibly delicate, drawing sounds from the old piano that Whitmore hadn't thought it was capable of producing. When David's right hand entered with the main melody, the room seemed to hold its breath. The theme began simply, almost shyly, like a question being asked in the dark. But there was something in the way David shaped each phrase that suggested deep currents running beneath the surface. Dr. Chen had completely abandoned her paperwork now. As head of the piano department, she had heard this piece performed hundreds of times by students and professionals alike. But she was hearing something in David's interpretation that made her listen, as if she were encountering the music for the first time. The melody began to develop and grow, and with it, David's playing became more confident. His fingers moved across the keyboard with fluid precision, never rushing, never hesitating. Each note seemed to emerge naturally from the one before it, creating long, singing lines that made the old piano sound like a completely different instrument. As the piece moved into its first major development, David's technique began to reveal itself fully. His left hand took on a more prominent role, providing not just harmonic support but engaging in actual conversation with the melody in his right hand. The two hands seemed to be telling each other stories, sometimes agreeing, sometimes arguing, always connected. Professor Hamilton found himself leaning forward in his chair. Even though he was a strings teacher, he could recognize extraordinary musicianship when he heard it. This young man wasn't just playing the notes on the page. He was inhabiting the music, living inside it, making it his own while still honoring Chopin's intentions. The piano's imperfections, which had seemed so obvious and distracting when David first sat down, were now completely forgotten. Somehow, he had learned to work around the sticky keys and the slightly out-of-tune notes, incorporating them seamlessly into his performance. The buzzing F that had been so noticeable during his warm-up now blended into the texture of the music like it belonged there. As the piece built toward its first climax, David's playing grew more passionate without becoming rough or aggressive. His whole body was involved now, his shoulders moving slightly with the longer phrases, his torso swaying gently with the music's natural rhythm. But it was never showy or theatrical. Every movement seemed necessary. Every gesture seemed to serve the music. The first big climactic section arrived, and David's hands moved across the keyboard with breathtaking speed and accuracy. Rapid scales and arpeggios flew by like lightning, but every note was crystal clear. More importantly, even in the most technically demanding passages, the musical line never got lost. You could still follow the melody, still hear the story the music was telling. Dr. Chen glanced quickly at her colleagues and saw her own amazement reflected in their faces. Professor Hamilton's mouth was slightly open, and even Professor Whitmore had set down his pen entirely and was staring at David with an expression she had never seen before. Complete, bewildered attention. After the first climax, the music returned to quieter territory and David's playing became intimate again. But now there was a depth to the quiet passages that hadn't been there before, as if the dramatic moments had revealed new layers of meaning in the simpler music. His control in these soft sections was extraordinary, each note perfectly judged, creating a sense of suspended time. The middle section of the ballade began, and with it came some of the most technically challenging music ever written for the piano. Rapid passage work in both hands, complex rhythmic patterns and harmonic progressions that would trip up even experienced performers. David approached it all with the same calm confidence he had shown from the beginning. But technique was only part of what made this performance so remarkable. David wasn't just executing the difficult passages correctly. He was finding meaning in them. Every run, every arpeggio, every complex harmonic progression seemed to be saying something specific, contributing to the overall narrative of the piece. Professor Whitmore realized that his heart was beating faster. He had built his career on his ability to recognize genuine musical talent, and he was hearing something now that challenged everything he thought he knew about where that talent came from. This young man, with his thrift store suit and his community center training, was playing at a level that most of the Academy's graduates never achieved. As the piece moved into its final section, David's playing took on an almost transcendent quality. The music built inexorably toward its dramatic conclusion, but every moment of that build was carefully controlled and perfectly shaped. You could feel the tension growing, but it never felt rushed or forced. The final pages of the ballade contain some of the most difficult and emotionally intense music in the entire piano repertoire. David played them with a combination of technical mastery and emotional maturity that left everyone in the room stunned. His hands moved across the keyboard like he had been playing this piano his entire life, drawing sounds from it that seemed impossible. The climactic ending arrived with overwhelming power, but even in the most dramatic moments, every note was placed with surgical precision. The final cascade of notes that brings the piece to its conclusion rang through the room with perfect clarity, each voice in the complex texture audible and meaningful. And then, suddenly, it was over. David's hands lifted from the keyboard, and the last notes died away into a silence that seemed to stretch forever. He sat completely still for a moment, his hands resting in his lap, his head slightly bowed. The music was finished, but its presence still filled the room like incense. Professor Whitmore stared at David as if seeing him for the first time. Dr. Chen had tears in her eyes. Professor Hamilton was shaking his head in disbelief. In the space of 12 minutes, everything they thought they knew about musical training, about talent, about who belonged at an institution like Berkshire Music Academy, had been completely overturned by a 19-year-old boy from the wrong side of town who had learned to play piano in the basement of a community center. The silence stretched on, nobody quite sure how to respond to what they had just witnessed. David finally looked up at the judges, waiting quietly for whatever would come next, having no idea that he had just changed everything. The silence that followed David's performance was unlike anything that had ever existed in that audition room before. It wasn't the polite pause that usually came after student performances, while judges gathered their thoughts and prepared their standard feedback. This was something deeper, more profound. The kind of silence that happens when something extraordinary has just taken place and no one quite knows how to process it. David sat perfectly still at the piano bench, his hands folded quietly in his lap. He had learned from Mrs. Patterson never to immediately jump up after finishing a piece, to let the music settle and find its natural conclusion in the space. But as the seconds ticked by without any response from the judges, he began to wonder if something had gone wrong. Professor Whitmore was staring at him with an expression David had never seen on anyone's face before. The professor's mouth was slightly open, his expensive pen hanging loosely in his fingers. His usually perfect posture slumped forward as if someone had just told him shocking news. His silver hair, so carefully styled that morning, now looked disheveled because he had been running his free hand through it without realizing. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the head of the piano department, had both hands pressed to her mouth as if trying to hold back words that wanted to escape. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, and she was shaking her head very slightly from side to side. Not in disapproval, but in the kind of amazement that comes from witnessing something you didn't think was possible. Professor Hamilton, the strings teacher, was the first to break the tableau. He set down his papers with hands that were noticeably trembling and leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly like someone who had been holding their breath for a very long time. "My God," he whispered, so quietly that David almost didn't hear him. The words seemed to break whatever spell had held the room. Captive, Dr. Chen slowly lowered her hands from her mouth and reached for her water glass with fingers that shook slightly. Professor Whitmore blinked several times as if trying to clear his vision, then looked down at the evaluation form in front of him as though he had never seen such a thing before. David watched all of this with growing confusion. In his experience, auditions ended with the judges thanking him politely and telling him when he could expect to hear their decision. Sometimes they offered a few words of feedback or encouragement, but this strange weighted silence was completely outside his experience. Had he made some terrible mistake that he hadn't noticed? Had the piano's imperfections caused problems with his performance that he hadn't heard? He quickly ran through the piece in his mind, trying to identify where things might have gone wrong, but he couldn't think of anything. The performance had felt good to him. More than good, actually. It had felt like one of those rare moments when everything came together perfectly. Professor Whitmore finally seemed to collect himself enough to speak, but when he opened his mouth, no words came out. He closed it again, cleared his throat, and tried once more. He began, then stopped. He looked down at his evaluation form, then back up at David, then at his fellow judges as if seeking help from them. Dr. Chen had recovered enough to trust her voice. "David," she said, and was surprised to hear how rough her voice sounded. She cleared her throat and tried again. David, how long have you been playing piano? 12 years, David replied simply. Since I was 7. And you said in your application that you've never had private lessons? Professor Hamilton asked, leaning forward intently. David nodded. No, sir. Mrs. Patterson at the community center taught me to read music when I started, and she helped me with basic technique for the first couple of years. But after that, I mostly learned on my own from books and videos. The judges exchanged looks that David couldn't interpret. Dr. Chen was shaking her head again, but this time it seemed more like disbelief than amazement. Videos, Professor Whitmore repeated faintly. You learned that from videos. It wasn't really a question, more like someone trying to convince themselves that what they had just heard was actually possible. Professor Whitmore had spent his entire career surrounded by students who had studied with the world's most renowned teachers, who had attended the finest music schools, who had access to every advantage that money and connections could provide, and he had just heard a performance that surpassed most of what those privileged students could achieve. The recording quality wasn't always great, David said, misinterpreting the professor's tone as criticism, and sometimes the videos would buffer or cut out in the middle of important parts. But I could usually figure out what I was missing by listening carefully and trying different things. Dr. Chen actually laughed out loud at this, though it came out more like a sob. You figured it out, she repeated. You figured out how to play Chopin's first ballade by watching videos that buffered. David was starting to feel genuinely worried now. The judges all seemed upset or disturbed by his performance, though he couldn't understand why. Maybe he had misunderstood what they wanted to hear. Maybe Chopin wasn't appropriate for this audition. Maybe his technique, self-taught as it was, had revealed flaws that were obvious to trained musicians but invisible to him. Should I have chosen a different piece? He asked quietly. I have some Bach prepared and a Mozart sonata. I could play something else if you'd prefer. This innocent offer seemed to hit the judges like a physical blow. Professor Hamilton actually put his hand to his forehead and closed his eyes. Dr. Chen made a small sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a cry. And Professor Whitmore just stared at David as if he were looking at a creature from another planet. You have other pieces prepared, Professor Whitmore said slowly. At that level? Yes, sir, David replied, genuinely confused by the question. Mrs. Patterson always said that a real pianist should know music from different periods and styles. She helped me pick pieces that would show different aspects of technique and interpretation. The mention of Mrs. Patterson seemed to focus Professor Whitmore's attention. This Mrs. Patterson, he said. What are her qualifications? Where did she study? David thought about this question. He realized he had never asked Mrs. Patterson about her background in any formal sense. She was just Mrs. Patterson, the woman who ran the community center and who had first shown him how to place his hands on the piano keys. I'm not sure about her qualifications, David admitted. She never really talked about where she studied. She just knew music. She could hear when something wasn't right, and she always knew how to help me fix it. She said the most important thing was to listen to the music and let it tell you what it needed. Dr. Chen was writing furiously on her evaluation form now, filling out sections that she had never had reason to use before. Professor Hamilton was staring at David like he was trying to solve a puzzle, and Professor Whitmore was still sitting in stunned silence, apparently trying to reconcile everything he had just heard with everything he believed about musical education. The silence stretched out again, but this time it felt different. Less shocked, more thoughtful. The judges were clearly processing something much bigger than a simple audition. They were grappling with questions that went to the heart of everything they thought they knew about talent, training, and what it meant to be a musician. David sat quietly and waited, his hands still folded in his lap, completely unaware that he had just performed what might have been the most remarkable audition in the history of Berkshire Music Academy. Professor Whitmore slowly rose from his chair, his movements careful and deliberate like a man who had just received life-changing news. He walked around the judges' table and approached the piano where David still sat waiting. The expensive Italian leather shoes that had clicked so confidently across the marble floors that morning now moved hesitantly, as if their owner was no longer sure of his footing. David, Professor Whitmore said, and his voice was completely different from the dismissive tone he had used earlier. The authority was still there, but it was softer now, almost gentle. Would you mind if I asked you some questions about your musical background? David nodded, still uncertain about what was happening but willing to cooperate. Of course, sir. Professor Whitmore pulled up a chair and sat down facing David, abandoning the formal distance that usually separated judges from audition candidates. For the first time since entering the room, David felt like he was talking to a real person rather than an intimidating authority figure. You mentioned that you practice at a community center, Professor Whitmore began. Can you tell me about that? What's it like? David thought about how to describe the basement room that had been his musical home for 12 years. It's not fancy, he said simply. The piano is old, probably older than the one here. Some of the keys stick, and it goes out of tune pretty quickly because of the humidity from the furnace. But it has a nice sound when you get to know it. How often do you practice? Dr. Chen asked from behind her table. Every day, David replied. Usually about 4 hours, sometimes more on weekends. I have to work around the center's schedule. They have other programs during the day, so I usually practice early in the morning or late at night. Professor Hamilton was writing notes furiously. 4 hours a day for 12 years, he muttered, doing quick calculations in his head. That's over 15,000 hours of practice, and you've never had access to a quality instrument during all that time? Professor Whitmore asked, and there was something in his voice that might have been regret. David shrugged. I've played some nice pianos at the library sometimes when they have events, and once Mrs. Patterson took me to hear a concert at the Symphony Hall. The pianist there was incredible, and afterward, they let me try the piano for a few minutes. But mostly it's just been the old upright at the center. Professor Whitmore closed his eyes for a moment as if processing this information caused him physical pain. Here was a young man who had developed extraordinary musical abilities, despite having access to resources that most of Whitmore's students would consider completely inadequate. The professor thought about his current students, with their expensive private lessons and their perfectly maintained instruments at home, and realized that most of them would never achieve what David had just demonstrated. Tell me about Mrs. Patterson, Dr. Chen said, leaning forward with genuine curiosity. How did she guide your musical development? David's face lit up at the mention of his first teacher. She's amazing. She never made me feel bad about not knowing things that other kids might have learned in formal lessons. Instead, she would help me figure out how to discover things for myself. Like when I was struggling with pedaling technique, she didn't just tell me the rules. She had me listen to recordings of great pianists and try to hear how they used the pedal to shape the sound. She taught you to listen, Professor Whitmore said quietly, more to himself than to David. That's what she always said was most important, David continued. She would tell me that the music itself would teach me what I needed to know, as long as I was really listening. She said that technique was just the tool to help the music speak clearly, but first you had to hear what it was trying to say. The judges exchanged meaningful looks. This was exactly the kind of musical philosophy that was taught at the highest levels of musical education. Yet David had absorbed it from a community center volunteer with unknown formal credentials. Professor Whitmore stood up and began pacing slowly around the room, his hands clasped behind his back. David, I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand how difficult this is for me to say. David tensed slightly, preparing himself for disappointment. This was probably where they would thank him for coming, but explain why he wasn't quite right for Berkshire Academy. When you walked into this room today, Professor Whitmore continued, I had already decided that you didn't belong here. I looked at your background, your lack of formal training, your circumstances, and I concluded that you were wasting everyone's time. The professor stopped pacing and turned to face David directly. I was wrong. Not just slightly wrong, but completely, fundamentally wrong about everything I thought I understood about musical talent and education. David blinked in surprise. This was not what he had expected to hear. What you just played, Dr. Chen added, her voice still slightly shaky, was one of the most remarkable performances I've heard in 20 years of teaching. The technical skill was extraordinary, but more than that, your musical understanding, your interpretive insights, your ability to communicate emotion through the instrument. These are things that most musicians spend decades trying to develop. Professor Hamilton nodded emphatically. I've heard that piece performed by graduate students, by professional musicians, by internationally recognized artists. What you just did belongs in that company. Professor Whitmore sat back down in his chair facing David. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "The way I treated you when you first came in, the things I said about the piano, about your background, that was inexcusable. I let my prejudices blind me to what should have been obvious the moment I heard you play." David didn't know how to respond to this. Adults rarely apologized to him, especially adults in positions of authority. "It's okay," he said awkwardly. "I'm used to people making assumptions." "But it's not okay," Professor Whitmore insisted. "And the fact that you're used to it makes it worse, not better. You shouldn't have to prove yourself over and over again because people can't see past their own narrow definitions of what talent looks like." The professor stood up again and walked back to the judge's table, where he picked up David's application and read it more carefully than he had that morning. "It says here that you work part-time to help support your family," he noted. "Yes, sir. I stock shelves at a grocery store on weekends and some evenings. My mom works really hard, but things are tight sometimes." Professor Whitmore set down the application and looked at his fellow judges. Without saying a word, they seemed to communicate something important. Dr. Chen nodded slightly. Professor Hamilton smiled and gave a small thumbs up. "David," Professor Whitmore said, turning back to face him, "I think it's time we discussed your future at Berkshire Music Academy." For the first time since the performance ended, David allowed himself to hope. But he was still afraid to assume anything. "Sir, pending the formality of committee approval, which I can assure you will be immediate and unanimous, I would like to offer you a full scholarship to Berkshire Music Academy, effective immediately." David felt like the room was spinning. A scholarship? The full scholarship? Full tuition, room and board, meal plan, and a stipend for books and incidental expenses, Dr. Chen confirmed, smiling broadly for the first time since David had entered the room. Plus access to our practice facilities 7 days a week, including the concert grand pianos. Professor Whitmore cleared his throat. "There's one more thing, David. I'd like to personally arrange for you to audition for our accelerated program. Based on what I heard today, I believe you might be ready to skip some of the introductory coursework and move directly into advanced study." David stared at them, unable to fully process what he was hearing. Just an hour ago, he had been sitting outside this room, worried that he might embarrass himself in front of people who didn't think he belonged here. Now they were offering him everything he had dreamed of and more. "I don't know what to say," he managed finally. "Say yes," Professor Whitmore said with a smile that transformed his entire face. "And then call Mrs. Patterson and tell her that she has just become the most successful piano teacher in the history of music education." 3 years later, the backstage area of Carnegie Hall buzzed with the nervous energy that always preceded a major concert. Musicians tuned their instruments, stage managers checked lighting cues, and audience members filled the historic hall's red velvet seats. But in a quiet corner of the green room, a young man sat alone at an upright piano, not unlike the one where his journey had begun. David's fingers moved silently over the keys, not making any sound but going through the motions of the piece he would perform that evening. It was the same Chopin ballade that had changed his life during that audition at Berkshire Music Academy. But tonight, it would be heard by 2,000 people, including music critics from major newspapers and representatives from the world's most prestigious orchestras. The past 3 years had been a whirlwind that David still sometimes couldn't believe was real. True to Professor Whitmore's word, the scholarship approval had been immediate and unanimous. The Berkshire Academy Board of Trustees had been so impressed by David's story that they had created a new program specifically designed to identify and support talented students from underserved communities. David had thrown himself into his studies with the same dedication he had shown during those long hours in the community center basement, but now, instead of practicing on a temperamental old upright, he had access to pristine concert grand pianos and soundproof practice rooms. Instead of learning from grainy internet videos, he studied with professors who had trained at the world's finest conservatories. The adjustment hadn't always been easy. David had struggled with imposter syndrome during his first semester, surrounded by classmates who spoke casually about their summers at prestigious music festivals and their private lessons with famous teachers. But his natural talent and work ethic had quickly won over both his peers and his professors. Professor Whitmore had become an unlikely mentor, working closely with David to develop his technique and expand his repertoire. The relationship had been transformative for both of them. For David, it provided access to musical knowledge and opportunities he had never imagined possible. For Professor Whitmore, it had been a humbling lesson in recognizing talent wherever it might appear, and understanding that excellence could emerge from the most unexpected places. The professor really changed after your audition, Dr. Chen had told David during his second year. He started paying more attention to students who didn't fit the typical profile. He even convinced the board to expand the community outreach program. You opened his eyes to possibilities he had never considered. Mrs. Patterson had been David's first guest when he moved into his dormitory room at Berkshire. She had walked through the marble halls with quiet pride, not intimidated by the grandeur but clearly understanding what this opportunity meant for her former student. "I always knew you had something special," she had told him as they sat together in one of the academy's practice rooms. "But I also knew that talent without opportunity is just a seed that never gets planted. I'm so proud of you for making the most of this chance." David had kept in touch with Mrs. Patterson throughout his time at Berkshire, calling her regularly to share his progress and seek her advice. She had become something of a celebrity at the community center, where a framed newspaper article about David's scholarship hung proudly in the main hallway. Now, as David prepared for the most important performance of his life, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. The community center had started a scholarship fund in his name, helping other young musicians access better instruments and instruction. Professor Whitmore had become a passionate advocate for music education equity, speaking at conferences about the importance of looking beyond traditional measures of musical preparation. A gentle knock on the green room door interrupted David's silent practice. Professor Whitmore stepped in, wearing the formal evening wear required for such occasions, but his expression was warm and paternal. "How are you feeling?" the professor asked, settling into a chair beside the piano. "Nervous," David admitted with a smile. "But the good kind of nervous. The kind that means something important is about to happen." Professor Whitmore nodded with understanding. "I remember the first time I performed at Carnegie Hall. I was so terrified I could barely hold my violin bow steady. But once the music started, everything else faded away." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both reflecting on how much had changed since that September morning when David had first walked into the audition room at Berkshire Academy. "Professor," David said quietly, "I want to thank you again for everything you've done for me. Not just the scholarship and the opportunities, but for admitting when you were wrong and being willing to change your mind about what talent looks like." Professor Whitmore's eyes grew thoughtful. "David, you have to understand, you didn't just change my mind about you. You changed my mind about everything. About teaching, about music, about what we're really trying to accomplish in education. That audition was a wake-up call I desperately needed." A stage manager appeared in the doorway. "5 minutes, Mr. Rodriguez." David stood up and straightened his concert attire, a perfectly tailored tuxedo that was a far cry from the thrift store suit he had worn to his audition. But in some ways, he was still the same young man who had sat down at that old upright piano and decided to show the world what he could do. "Ready?" Professor Whitmore asked, standing as well. "Ready?" David replied. As they walked toward the stage entrance, David could hear the murmur of the audience settling into their seats. Somewhere in that crowd sat his mother, who had never missed a performance since his first recital at Berkshire. Mrs. Patterson was there too, having been flown in by the Academy as David's special guest. The stage lights came up, and David walked out to thunderous applause. The Steinway concert grand piano sat center stage, gleaming under the lights like a piece of polished ebony. As David sat down at the bench and adjusted his position, the hall fell silent. He placed his hands over the keys and took the same deep, centering breath he had learned to take years ago in that community center basement. The silence stretched for just a moment, and then the opening notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor began to fill Carnegie Hall. But this time, when David played that piece that had changed everything, the story it told was different. It was still Chopin's story of struggle and triumph, of questions and answers, of darkness giving way to light. But now it was also David's story, a testament to the power of talent nurtured by dedication, of dreams sustained by hard work, and of opportunities seized by those brave enough to believe in themselves. In the audience, Professor Whitmore listened with tears in his eyes, remembering the moment when his own prejudices had nearly prevented him from recognizing one of the most gifted musicians he had ever encountered. It was a lesson he would never forget, and one that had made him a better teacher, a better judge of talent, and ultimately, a better human being. When the final notes died away and the audience rose to its feet in thunderous applause, David stood and bowed deeply. As he looked out at the standing ovation, he caught sight of Professor Whitmore in the front row, applauding with genuine pride and admiration. Later at the reception following the concert, a young reporter from a music magazine approached David with a question that made him smile. "Mr. Rodriguez, what advice would you give to young musicians who feel like they don't fit the traditional mold?" David thought for a moment, remembering that scared 19-year-old who had walked into the Berkshire Academy audition room 3 years ago. "I'd tell them that talent isn't about where you come from or what advantages you've had," he said. "It's about the music that lives inside you and your willingness to work hard enough to let it out. And I'd tell them that there are people out there who will recognize that talent when they hear it, even if it takes a while to find them." As the evening wound down and the last guest filtered out of the reception, David found himself once again at a piano, this time a beautiful grand in the venue's private salon. Professor Whitmore joined him, and together they sat in companionable silence, both reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. "You know," Professor Whitmore said finally, "I used to think my job was to maintain standards and preserve tradition. But you taught me that sometimes the most important thing a teacher can do is recognize when their standards need to evolve." David smiled and played a few gentle notes. Not Chopin this time, but a simple melody that Mrs. Patterson had taught him years ago in that community center basement. It was a reminder of where he had come from, and a promise that he would never forget the people and places that had made his success possible. The sound of those simple notes filled the room with warmth, carrying with them the story of a young man who had dared to dream beyond his circumstances, and the adults who had been wise enough to help make those dreams come true.